You step outside into air so cold it burns your lungs. The wind feels like shards of glass hitting your skin. There is no thermostat to turn up, no insulated jacket hanging by the door, and no grocery store down the street. How long would you survive? For thousands of years, this extreme freeze was not an occasional winter storm. Around 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum, the absolute peak of the last ice age, gripped the planet. It buried vast stretches of the northern hemisphere under sheets of solid ice miles thick. Today, a modern human turns up the thermostat if the indoor temperature drops below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Your ancestors survived an era where global temperatures dropped by an average of 11 degrees and sub-zero winters lasted for 9 months of the year. How did a tropical ape with no natural fur, no sharp claws, and no thick layers of body fat conquer the deadliest freeze in human history? Your body is fundamentally a creature of the tropics. Your skin is thin, your sweat glands are designed to dump heat, and your limbs are long to maximize surface area cooling. If you are exposed to extreme cold without protection, your core temperature drops rapidly. Hypothermia sets in within minutes as your blood vessels constrict to protect your vital organs. Your fingers lose dexterity, your speech slurs, and your mind slips into a fatal confusion. Yet, your ancestors did not just survive this frozen landscape, they claimed it as their home. To understand how this was possible, you must travel to modern-day Russia, to an archaeological site known as Sungir. Discovered by archaeologists in the mid-20th century, this site contains the graves of individuals who lived right at the height of the Ice Age. The skeletons found there were not buried in crude, primitive ditches. They were adorned with thousands of meticulously carved mammoth ivory beads. Dr. Otto Bader, the lead excavator, noted that these beads were arranged in straight, parallel lines across the skeletons. This detail reveals a profound technological breakthrough. The beads were not loose ornaments draped over the bodies. They were sewn directly onto form-fitting garments made of leather and heavy fur. This brings you to a critical distinction discovered by researchers like Dr. Ian Gilligan, an archaeologist who specializes in the prehistory of clothing. He notes that there is a massive difference between simple clothing and complex clothing. Simple clothing consists of loose animal skins draped over the shoulders like a cape. It works well enough in mild climates, but it is utterly useless in an Arctic blizzard. Complex clothing is tailored. It features fitted sleeves, separate trousers, and tight seams that trap an insulating layer of air directly against your skin. To survive the Ice Age, your ancestors had to become master tailors. How do you create airtight clothing without modern sewing machines or metal needles? The answer lies in an evolutionary leap made of bone. Your ancestors invented the eyed bone needle, a tiny tool that completely transformed human geography. They used flintstone tools to split animal bones into thin splinters, scraped them smooth, and painstakingly drilled a microscopic hole through one end. With this tool, they could use animal sinew as thread to stitch multiple layers of specialized furs together. They understood the unique properties of different animal skins. They used tough, water-resistant reindeer hide for the outer layers of boots and parkas. They used soft fox or hare fur for inner linings to prevent chafing and maximize warmth. They even used the long, stiff guard hairs of wolverines around the hoods of their jackets. This specific fur does not collect frost from human breath, keeping the face dry and preventing frostbite. Imagine walking through this landscape 20,000 years ago. The sky is an intense, piercing blue, and the ground is covered in a vast expanse of frozen soil. This environment was not a barren, empty wasteland of pure snow. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe, a unique, incredibly dry grassland that stretched from Western Europe all the way across Asia and into North America. Because the massive ice sheets locked up most of the world's moisture, it rarely rained or snowed heavily. The sun shone brightly on a sea of highly nutritious grasses that grew during the brief, intense summers. This vegetation supported millions of giant animals, known collectively as megafauna. You would see giant woolly mammoths moving like living mountains across the horizon. You would watch herds of woolly rhinoceroses, massive bison, and swift steppe horses kicking up dust and frost. Food was everywhere, but obtaining it required unparalleled cooperation and strategy. Hunting these giant creatures was a test of supreme intelligence rather than brute force. You could not simply run up to a woolly mammoth with a wooden spear and expect to survive. Your ancestors relied on deep environmental observation and complex physics. They engineered stone weapon systems using a technology called microblading. They chipped away tiny, razor-sharp flakes of flint and embedded them into the sides of bone or wooden spear points using natural resin glue. When these spears penetrated an animal, the microblades broke off inside the wound, causing rapid internal bleeding and tracking options. Do you know how much caloric energy a single mammoth provided to a hungry tribe? A single adult mammoth could yield several tons of meat, fat, and dense bone marrow, enough to sustain a community for months. Securing food was only half the battle, because the winter night was always waiting. When the brief summer ended, temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, and the sun barely peeked over the horizon. Finding shelter on a flat steppe completely devoid of trees was an existential challenge. You could not build a log cabin when there were no forests for hundreds of miles. Your ancestors solved this problem with a stunning feat of Paleolithic architecture. If you travel to Mezhyrich in modern-day Ukraine, you will find the remains of shelters that defy imagination. Archaeologists like Dr. I.G. Pitoplichko excavated homes built entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. These were not random piles of debris. They were highly engineered, circular structures that utilized different bones for specific architectural purposes. The outer foundation was constructed using massive mammoth jaw bones, stacked carefully in an interlocking herringbone pattern to resist the fierce steppe winds. Long, curved mammoth tusks were used to create roof rafters that arched gracefully over the center of the structure. The entire frame was then draped in heavy mammoth hides, weighted down at the edges by large boulders. Inside, a single home could measure over 20 feet across, providing a warm, windproof sanctuary for an entire extended family. Let us reconstruct a typical winter evening inside one of these mammoth bone homes. You sit on a floor insulated with thick layers of dried grasses and soft willow bark. Outside, a howling Arctic blizzard beats against the thick hide walls, but inside, the air is surprisingly comfortable. A central hearth glows with a steady, intense heat. Because wood is non-existent on the tundra, your ancestors burned dried animal bones soaked in fat and marrow, which burns slowly like charcoal. The air carries the heavy scent of roasting meat and melting grease. Elders sit near the fire, using flint tools to repair tools or carve new bone needles. Children watch intently, learning the precise angles needed to pressure flake a flint blade. This was not a desperate, miserable struggle on the brink of extinction. This was a thriving, organized community that turned a frozen nightmare into a cradle of human culture. To maintain this lifestyle, your ancestors had to manage a delicate nutritional balance. You might think eating a diet of pure lean meat would keep you healthy in a harsh winter. In reality, relying solely on lean meat leads to a dangerous condition known as protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. The human liver can only process a certain amount of protein per day before toxic urea builds up in the blood. To survive extreme cold, your body desperately needs fat. Fat provides more than twice the caloric energy of carbohydrates or protein, and it is vital for maintaining cellular health and brain function. Your ancestors targeted the fattest animals, craving the thick back fat of winter bison and the rich marrow hidden deep inside mammoth leg bones. They developed preservation techniques to store this precious energy. They dug deep pits into the permafrost, creating natural subterranean freezers that kept meat fresh for months. This brings us to a profound counterintuitive twist about human evolution. You might assume that the brutal conditions of the Ice Age isolated human groups, forcing them into small, insular tribes that fought over scarce resources. The archaeological evidence suggests exactly the opposite occurred. The extreme challenges of the environment forced your ancestors to expand their social networks across immense distances. By analyzing the chemical signatures of flint tools found at various Ice Age sites, researchers have tracked the movement of materials across hundreds of kilometers. A tribe living in a mammoth bone hut in Ukraine might use premium amber translucent flint that could only be sourced from a valley hundreds of miles away. This means human groups were actively trading, sharing information, and forming alliances across vast geographic regions. They gathered at macro band camps during the summer months to exchange gifts, find marriage partners, and share survival strategies. They painted deep inside caves like Chauvet and Lascaux, creating magnificent galleries of the animals they lived alongside. The Ice Age did not isolate humanity. It connected us, forging a global culture rooted in shared symbolic language and mutual aid. Consider how this deep past mirrors your modern existence. You live in a world where technology completely insulates you from the natural rhythms of the earth. You can cross oceans in hours, change the temperature of your room with a smartphone app, and buy fresh fruit in the dead of winter. Yet your physical body and your psychological architecture remain unchanged from the people who lived in the mammoth-bone huts. Your biological stress response, which fires up when you face a looming deadline or a difficult conversation, is the exact same system that kept your ancestors alert when tracking a cave lion through the snow. Your intense craving for high-fat, high-calorie foods is a direct genetic inheritance from an era when fat was the ultimate shield against freezing to death. You are an Ice Age survivor walking through a digital world. The next time you step outside on a bitter winter morning, take a deep breath. Feel the crisp air hit your lungs and notice how your body naturally tenses up to generate heat. Remember that you do not come from a line of weak creatures who barely manage to cling to life. You come from master tailors, brilliant architects, and deeply connected communities who looked at a world covered in miles of ice and chose to thrive. You step outside into air so cold it burns your lungs.